August 18th, 1985. Wealthy San Francisco socialite Muriel Collins Barnett enjoys the company of other passengers aboard a luxury cruise liner. For Muriel, this has been one of countless lavish vacations she has enjoyed, exploring beautiful parts of the world in high-class luxury. But little does she know, this will be her final voyage. In less than 24 hours, Muriel's smooth sailing life will hit rocky seas. In the shadow of this horrific murder unfolds the story of a jilted lover, a last will and testament, and greed. Muriel Collins Barnett is the wealthy widowed heiress of the late San Francisco lawyer Philip Barnett. She resides in an opulent mansion in the upscale San Francisco neighborhood known as Nob Hill.
This was a very wealthy couple in San Francisco, Philip and Muriel Barnett. He was a lawyer who became a land developer, and they were rich and snobby.
In the 2 years since her husband's death, Muriel has spent a large portion of her time traveling the world with her personal secretary and companion, Robert Frisby.
Muriel Collins Barnett is an elderly woman from the San Francisco area. She was married to a wealthy businessman from that area who recently passed away, left her a fairly large sum of money. And since her husband's death, she has enjoyed her life, spending the money that she was left as an inheritance.
Robert Frisby was initially hired by the late Philip Barnett and worked as his personal secretary until his death. When Mr. Barnett dies, he leaves his wife $3.7 million, which is more than enough to keep the childless widow comfortable for the rest of her life.
On the surface, Robert Frisby was hired by Muriel's husband as a personal assistant. But when Muriel's husband passed, he left a clause in his will that Robert would continue to stay on and work for his wife.
Her husband had asked that he stay on and be her personal assistant after his death. So they've become quite close over the years since her husband's passing.
He was not just an employee, he was also kind of almost their son. He was their chauffeur, their secretary, the dishwasher, their social convener.
Although always a heavy drinker, Frisby begins to drink even more after the passing of Mr. Barnett. He enjoys his time with Muriel. Getting to travel and enjoy the finer things is a plus for him. He's surprised that he is not set free with a legacy endowment from Philip. Instead, Frisby is instructed by Philip Barnett's will to be passed on to continue employment with Mrs. Barnett.
This is an ideal situation for a crime novelist. You have these rich socialites. They have more money than they know what to do with, living the dream, traveling all around the world, going to these exotic, beautiful places, and then this man who's almost forced to work for them, being dragged along with them. There's got to be some resentment building there.
Muriel is more and more dependent on Frisby as time goes on. After falling and sustaining a minor neck fracture, she relies heavily on him to assist her in her day-to-day needs. Once she's feeling better, Muriel decides to go on a trip, taking Frisbee with her. Muriel even goes as far as making extensive plans for a series of trips where she and Frisbee will travel around the world for more than half the year. But another health setback strikes the pair when Muriel and Frisbee are on tour in Europe. After only 3 weeks abroad, Frisbee suffers 2 grand mal seizures and is hospitalized. The two fly back to San Francisco, where Frisbee is ordered to rest for 6 weeks. He is also prescribed the tranquilizer Librium.
Things aren't always smooth once Muriel's husband passes away. It seems that one of them or the other, either Muriel or Robert, is always getting sick or getting injured, and it seems that quite often alcohol plays a role.
After he started feeling a little better, they resumed their trip and they continued traveling together.
After some rest, Frisbee agrees to join Muriel on a cruise up the Pacific coast. Muriel spares no expense and books the two of them in a premier first-class penthouse cabin.
The idea was this might be the last great spectacular cruise, and so she rented the most expensive suite on the cruise ship.
It comes with caviar, champagne on ice, a fully stocked bar. This isn't just your average little cabin on a cruise ship.
Cruise ships are divided into multiple classes of cabins. The top class of cabin is reserved for ultra elite, very wealthy people. They're very expensive, very opulent, quite large rooms.
Although he is impressed with the beauty of the luxury suite, Frisbee's frustrated that Muriel demands he stay in the suite with her rather than have his own quarters. While on the cruise, Muriel and Frisbee make friends with Mr. and Mrs. Bygart, a couple also in the first-class cabin. It becomes customary for the foursome to meet every day before dinner for cocktails and appetizers.
Muriel and Robert spent time with people of their own kind on the upper-class decks of the cruise ship. By all accounts, seemed to be quite friendly with one another.
On the morning of August 19th, the ship docks in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Muriel suggests that the four of them rent a limo and a driver for the day. She wants to take in the beautiful British colonial gardens, the Victorian architecture, hit up shops, and have lunch. Muriel is enjoying a lot of drinks with her lunch. She's laughing and calling out other patrons of the restaurant. She opens her purse and hands a credit card to the waitress and asks her to buy everyone a drink on her. The foursome arrive back at the ship before the 4:30 p.m. departure deadline. Even though there were a few awkward moments, they all seem to have enjoyed their day sightseeing and shopping. Robert Frisbee is noticeably an outsider, as he is still in the employment of Mrs. Barnett. Michael, the ship's penthouse butler, sees the pair heading to their suite. He takes the bags from Frisbee as he opens the door to their room. Muriel, still having a great time, twirls by Michael and accidentally drops her purse. A large wad of cash rolls out without her noticing. Michael is surprised at the amount of cash she's carrying around with her, and he's even more surprised that she didn't notice it drop out of her bag. He hands the wad of cash to Muriel, who simply laughs. Frisbee hands her a drink while she smiles and leads Michael out the door. Muriel heads to her bedroom to freshen up before Michael returns with her usual daily order of champagne and canapes. It's become a tradition for her and Frisbee before heading out to meet the Barnards in the Premier Lounge. But as Michael arrives around 6:45 p.m. with Muriel's nightly food and drink order, the unexpected occurs.
Michael knocks on the door, but oddly, no one answers.
Michael's puzzled that no one answers. He checks his watch. 6:45 p.m. He knocks again and leans in to listen at the door. He hears shuffling and then the door being unlocked. It's slow and sounds like a person is fumbling. And after a few moments, the door opens to a confused Robert Frisbee who stands there, dazed. As he steps inside, Michael is struck by the horrific scene. Blood splatter is all over the room. In front of him on the bed is Muriel's lifeless body. Wealthy San Francisco socialite Muriel Collins Barnett and her companion, Robert Frisbee, embark on a luxurious cruise. But the luxury turns to tragedy when the 80-year-old heiress is found savagely beaten to death in her master's suite.
When room service opens the door to deliver their champagne and canapes, they're greeted by Robert. And beyond Robert, he catches a glimpse of Muriel's badly beaten body.
This is so strange because in this case, Muriel's body was actually found in her suite. She was crumpled on the bed, lying face down, and had clearly been beaten about the head. There was blood all over the room, on the lampshade, on the curtains. It was quite a grisly crime scene.
Michael, the penthouse butler, is horrified by the grisly discovery. He looks to Frisbee, who appears to be in shock also. Michael runs out of the room and yells for help down the hall. Michael returns with 2 cabin stewards. The young men are also taken aback by the scene. One even checks the body for a pulse, while the other rushes to the phone to call for help. The ship's doctor is alerted and arrives on scene to assist. By now, the commotion has drawn the attention of other passengers. Soon, the hallway and entryway of the penthouse are filled with other guests peering into the suite. Muriel's friends, the Barnards, also hear the commotion from their room down the hall. They're already dressed for the dinner plans that they and Muriel had made earlier. The master bedroom is a grim sight. Muriel is face down and hunched over on the bed. Blood has now pooled around her. The doctor carefully but briefly examines Muriel. Muriel is pronounced dead. The small group of other passengers that formed are shocked. Word of the senseless crime spreads very quickly among the high-end first-class cabins. The ship's captain arrives at approximately 7 p.m. and goes over the scene. It's clear to everyone the injuries she sustained are fatal. She appears to have been bludgeoned in the head. Her forehead is a mess of blood and bone fragments.
Injuries caused by blunt force objects are catastrophic, resulting in massive blood loss. They can create huge pools of blood underneath a victim. Blood can be seen sprayed on walls and ceilings. A lot of information can come from just a few drops of blood. Where a person was standing when they were struck, where the person that was doing the striking may have been standing.
The captain insists a full investigation will take place when the cruise liner docks in San Francisco. Local authorities will take over as soon as possible.
Typically, a crime scene needs to be preserved as soon as possible so that the evidence can't be contaminated. This being a stateroom, it's as simple as locking the door and preventing anybody from going in or out of that room.
How could this happen? Who would do such a thing to a defenseless elderly woman? And how will they uncover who the murderer is aboard this ship? Wealthy San Francisco widow Muriel Collins Barnett is on an opulent cruise. The pinnacle of luxury and premier class ticket, she is enjoying the company of her contemporaries, surrounded by beautiful scenery and first-class accommodations. But the breathtaking beauty quickly turns to breathtaking terror. Muriel is found murdered in her luxury suite, bludgeoned and sustaining fatal injuries. Her travel companion, Robert Frisbee, whom she employs, is the first to see her in this state and has no idea what transpired.
Witness interviews are very important because they help us establish timelines. They help us determine where people were at particular moments. People would have seen each other, and if they're each referring to the other person in their statement, it helps to corroborate what's being said, especially when they're taken independently. Small details in witness statements, not necessarily what they saw, but the peripheral information can all be used to help corroborate their story.
The doctor begins the difficult task of gathering any evidence she may find so she can pass it all on to the investigators from the San Francisco PD. The doctor notices how shaken Michael appears and asks if he's all right. Michael becomes flustered and says he really liked Muriel, and this whole thing is so tragic. The first thing Michael tells the doctor is that he had a standing room service order that he delivered daily to Muriel's penthouse. She would have canapes and caviar every evening before heading to have cocktails in the premier lounge. He tells the doctor that he usually came between 6:30 p.m. and 6:45 p.m., which was approximately the time it was when he arrived earlier that evening. As for the stewards, they normally come into Muriel's suite when she's at dinner, which is approximately 8 p.m. They had been down the hall in another suite when Michael had come to them seeking help.
Muriel had been seen by several crew members carrying big wads of cash, but this cash was still found in a room and nothing else seemed to be missing. This clearly wasn't a robbery. So now suspicion was starting to point towards Robert Frisbee, who was the only other person in the suite at the time.
Upon looking in the bathroom, they find blood and a bloody towel in the sink. There also appears to be blood on Frisbee's bathrobe. The doctor asks Frisbee what has happened. Confused and a little disoriented, Frisbee finally says, "I don't know. I was asleep." Frisbee is clearly distraught. The doctor tries to comfort him and asks him what happened before. Frisbee tells the doctor that Muriel had asked him to make up some cocktails for the two of them. The drink is a mix of champagne and vodka or gin. He also admits that he took his prescribed medication, Librium.
Librium has several side effects, including drowsiness and confusion. Probably the last thing you want to do when you're on a medication like this is drink. Robert claims that he didn't do it, and it's questionable whether or not he even could do it. He blacked out. He doesn't even remember what happened.
People who are under the influence of medication in combination with alcohol typically have no recollection of what took place. They frequently black out. They're not awoken by sounds. They have very poor recollection of events.
Frisbee then goes on to say that after serving Muriel her French 75, that he went and had a bath.
Details are starting to surface now. Robert, conveniently, is starting to recall a few things. He remembers serving Muriel a French 75, which is a cocktail of champagne and either gin or vodka.
He listened to music and relaxed, drifting in and out of sleep. He didn't know how long he had been in the tub, but remembered Muriel coming into the bathroom at some point. Frisbee said he awoke to the sounds of knocking or soft thuds, but drifted back to sleep. He remembers nothing after that until he heard Michael knocking on the door with caviar.
So Robert's in the bath, asleep, and allegedly is woken up by the knocking of the delivery of their room service. It's unusual that he's woken up by the knocking on a door, but not woken up by the sounds of somebody being potentially bludgeoned to death within a few feet of him.
Meanwhile, the doctor questions Mrs. Bygart. She says that after the day of shopping, she went back to her room to freshen up and get ready for the dinner plans later that evening. She'd been blow-drying her hair when she heard the commotion in the hall. Mr. Bygart tells the doctor that he'd gone to the Premier Lounge to check the golf scores and relax while Mrs. Bygart got ready. The scores he wanted weren't available yet, so he went back to his suite. He arrived back in his suite when moments later he and Mrs. Bygart heard a commotion in the hall. They went to investigate and saw Michael, the butler, running frantically down the hall. The doctor examines Muriel's body a little closer. She believes that Muriel sustained 4 more blunt blows to the forehead, meaning Muriel saw her attacker. She looked into their eyes before succumbing to her injuries. Because the blood has not yet congealed, the doctor believes the attack must have happened shortly before 6:45 p.m. One of the stewards, who was in a nearby suite, tells the doctor and captain that he heard unusual banging noises earlier, at approximately 6:30 p.m. He says he thought they sounded like they were coming from penthouse number 6, Muriel's suite. Shortly after Muriel is pronounced dead, Robert Frisbee makes 2 phone calls, one to London, but doesn't reach anyone, and the other to San Francisco, where he reaches Daniel Kazakis.
Daniel Kazakis is Robert Frisbee's lover. This man is left alone all the time in San Francisco while Robert is out traveling with Muriel. So over time, this resentment and tension is built up in the relationship.
He liked to call himself the Reverend Dan Kazakis, and he had a mail-order divinity degree and would wander around town wearing a cross big enough you could crucify somebody on. And he was a bit of a racist too. He's an oddball fellow, but they were a couple.
Frisbee says only a few words to Kazakis, and then seems to be overcome with emotion. He hangs up and begins to cry. The captain notices that there appears to be blood on both a champagne bottle and a whiskey bottle in the bar cart by the bedroom door.
Once the autopsy is done, the medical examiner reveals that Muriel died from blunt force trauma. She was struck at least 4 times in the front of her head with a heavy object, which now the police are believing is one of the alcohol bottles that was found in the suite.
Our blood naturally coagulates, it clots. That's what stops us from bleeding from a small cut after a short period of time. So when you lose blood in large quantities, that same process takes place outside the body. So basically it's the blood becoming gelatinous and drying up. And that helps give an indication as to the time of the occurrence.
News of the grisly murder makes its way throughout the luxury ship. People are gassed. Whispers and shock spread. There is a killer on board the ship. Wealthy San Francisco widow Muriel Collins Barnett likes to enjoy the life of luxury. Living out her golden years traveling the world with companion Robert Frisbee and taking in the sights of the world's most beautiful locations. A picture-perfect vacation for a picture-perfect life. When tragedy strikes, a violent and cold-blooded end to a life of opulence. What could this sweet elderly lady have done to deserve such a vicious end? No police investigation occurs until the luxury cruise liner docks in San Francisco. Inspector Klotz from the San Francisco Police Department arrives. Inspector Klotz and his officers meet with the captain and doctor, who bring him up to speed on the events so far. Inspector Klotz interviews the Bygards, who talk about the events of the last day they saw Muriel alive. The premier lounge bartender vouches for Mr. Bygard being there during the time of Muriel's murder. He had ordered a drink and was watching sports highlights. Numerous other patrons saw him as well. The two cabin stewards tell Inspector Klotz that they had dropped off fresh towels to Mrs. Bygard right before they began cleaning the suite down the hall from Muriel's penthouse. A chef tells Inspector Klotz that Michael was in the kitchen having a snack and chatting with kitchen staff while he waited for the caviar and canapes for Muriel to be prepared. The investigators determine the small amount of blood on Michael's white glove indeed came from the bedroom door when he opened it as he said, and there's no possible way Michael could be responsible for the murder. They also determined that the weapon or weapons were most likely a full bottle of whiskey and a full bottle of wine. Both had blood on them and appeared to have been wet and then wiped.
Forensic evidence really refers to anything that can be analyzed scientifically, whether it's a fingerprint or a fiber of hair or a follicle of hair. That's all something that could be scientifically examined, and a determination can be made as to who owns it or where it came from.
Inspector Klotz and officers question Frisbee, who, though calmer, recounts the same events he told the ship's doctor and captain the day before. Speaking to those familiar with Miss Barnett, Klotz uncovers she became more and more dependent on Frisbee after her husband died. Partially because Muriel was a heavy drinker herself, and the neck fracture she sustained was actually due to a drunken fall. Muriel relied heavily on Frisbee to assist her in her day-to-day needs, and during this time even gave him power of attorney. She was also heavily medicated to ease the pain of her injury. It was during this time that she was persuaded to sign a codicil typed by Frisbee. The amendment to her will had her leaving Frisbee just over 2/3 of her estate, approximately $2 million, instead of her plans to initially just leave him $250,000. This codicil was witnessed only by Mr. Daniel Kazakis, Frisbee's lover. But one of the most surprising pieces of information that Inspector Klotz learns is that Robert Frisbee and Philip Barnett were secret lovers. It had been Philip's original directive to leave $250,000 for Frisbee, but he specified he must stay on and continue working with Muriel to collect his inheritance. There is now enough evidence to arrest Robert Frisbee. Frisbee is detained for 1 year while he awaits trial.
What we know is that Robert and Muriel's late husband had a romantic relationship. Whether or not Muriel knew about it is unknown.
Once they get to port, the evidence is so strong against Robert Frisbee that he's arrested. Once Robert is arrested, these troubling details begin to come forward. Primarily, that Robert wasn't just Muriel's husband's personal assistant, they were also lovers. They had a relationship.
As he was in his later years, he approached Robert Frisbee and sought a sexual relationship with him. And of course, Frisbee complied. He complied with everything the great man asked for. There was some dispute at the trial as to whether or not that relationship occurred, but the in-house maid, whose name was Connie DeLuca, testified there's no question about it. She's seen them together.
And then there's the will. Now, mysteriously, it's been changed. Unlike Philip's original directive to leave Robert $250,000, which is still pretty generous, now he's being left millions.
While in custody, Frisbee spends his time writing a novel he feels will be a bestseller. The book also contains some autobiographical elements of his life. The novel also features odd elements of fantasy. The issue of jurisdiction comes into question just as the U.S. trial is set to begin. They aren't sure if the crime took place in U.S. or Canadian waters. But Muriel's time of death determined the murder to have occurred in Canadian waters.
One of the most inconvenient things for investigators about murders on cruise ships is you have to figure out what waters they were on, what territory owns claim to it. And in this case, it turns out the murder didn't happen on American waters, so the trial has to move to Canada.
So once the details of the crime became apparent and that the crime occurred off the coast of Canada, it was determined that Canadian law would take precedent and he would be tried under Canadian law. Robert was then extradited to Canada to face murder charges.
The death occurred on the cruise ship as the ship was leaving Victoria and going through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which actually borders, the border between Canada and the U.S. runs straight down the middle of that strait. The Americans desperately wanted to prosecute the case in their own jurisdiction because it was a headline grabber. Of course, that became one of our defenses during the trial, that the ship was so close to the border that there was a reasonable doubt. You could not tell which side of the international border.
And so, the case is transferred to the Court of Queen's Bench in British Columbia, Canada. Robert Frisbee is extradited to face murder charges. Wealthy San Francisco heiress Muriel Collins Barnett is savagely and brutally beaten to death aboard a cruise ship headed up the Pacific coastline. When it's discovered that her servant and companion, Robert Frisbee, had Muriel's will amended to leave him over $2 million upon her death, police arrest Frisbie for murder. After determining the murder took place in Canadian waters, Frisbie is extradited to Victoria, British Columbia to face the charges. Robert Frisbie is charged with first-degree murder. The Crown's case states that Muriel Collins Barnett was murdered in cold blood as part of a plan that Frisbie had devised before departing San Francisco. The Crown alleges that Frisbie's motive was to prevent Muriel from changing her will back to her original intention of leaving him only $250,000 instead of the over $2 million that her will had been amended to. The police reveal that the European tour that was cut short from Frisbie's seizures were actually due to alcohol withdrawal. Frisbie attended Alcoholics Anonymous for 6 weeks, but when he started back at work with Miss Collins Barnett, he began drinking heavily again. The Crown presented evidence that inferred Frisbie had dealings with Daniel Kazakis that had taken place prior to departing San Francisco, such as signing over a $100,000 check from Collins Barnett that Kazakis tried to cash upon learning of her death. And when Frisbie was arrested, he had an uncashed check for $300,000 in his wallet from Muriel to himself. In both cases, neither check entries were added to her master ledger. Many believe Frisbie was pushed to forge these checks under the urging of boyfriend Kazakis.
He was the party that everyone believed, including the prosecution, including the defense, myself, who propelled Frisbie, persuaded him to do in Mrs. Barnett. And that was over a will. There was an issue as to whether or not the Reverend Dan Kazakis and Robert Frisbie conspired to have her sign a copy of a new will without her properly looking at it.
Frisbie testifies that both checks were written out and intended as gifts for him in compensation for being away from his boyfriend, Daniel Kazakis, for so long.
It was a very large amount, far larger than what he was being paid in salary. So it's very unusual to find this check in his wallet.
Muriel had wanted Frisbie to travel with her again to London, this time spending nearly half a year with her. Frisbie was worried about the long-distance strain on the relationship with Kazakis.
Robert was having Muriel sign documents before they left on their trip, some of which she may or may not have understood what she was signing. It now turns out that it may have been a codicil to the will, leaving him more than was actually intended.
Frisbie's defense lawyer argues that while Frisbie believes it's possible he killed Muriel, he did so without knowledge or control of his mental faculties. He has no recollection of the event. Frisbie's defense attorney has 2 psychiatrists testify that the combination of prolonged alcoholism and the use of the drug Librium mixed with alcohol could possibly produce a blackout in memory.
It's a frequent fallback for somebody who's a suspect in a homicide case that they blacked out as a result of alcohol or drugs or a combination of the two. This way they feel they don't have to account for anything they may have done.
They say it was unlikely he could have carried out such a violent attack without it being attributed to the combination of drugs and alcohol.
The defense was a mental defense, that he was, through drink and the Librium he was taking, and he was, as I say, an alcoholic, and he was pretty drunk that night. He was not aware of what he was doing at the time.
Therefore, making it a lesser charge of second-degree murder. Meanwhile, the Crown submits Frisbie's manuscript that was written while he was in custody in the U.S. A lot of it is written in Gregg shorthand, which Frisbie was proficient in. The novel is a dramatized account of the voyage and particularly the day of the murder from Frisbee's point of view. It includes Frisbee taking Librium, consuming alcohol, taking the bath, and a nap right after.
Naively, didn't realize that anything he was writing could be seized by the authorities in Canada when he arrived. And he entered that manuscript with a phrase that the prosecution it was in shorthand, had a shorthand expert tried to testify, saying was, "Tonight she must die."
While Robert was in custody awaiting trial, he was writing a novel or a novelette in which he was describing essentially the cruise that he and Muriel had been on. And in this manuscript that he had, it was discovered that he had written in a particular type of shorthand, "Tonight she must die." Now the Crown took that as his indication that this was when he was going to murder Muriel.
Robert Frisbee and his lawyer know his credibility is damaged by his inability to answer what the symbols in his manuscript mean. Frisbee asserts that the symbols did not mean "tonight she must die." The defense interviews a Greg shorthand expert. She reads the manuscript and states that she cannot construe exactly what the symbols mean, but gives a few alternatives to their interpretations. She reads it as, "Today she must lie." The Crown attorney is not buying this alternative interpretation. They assert to the judge and jury that Frisbee's motive for killing Muriel Collins Barnett was purely greed. $2 million worth.
The motive for the alleged murder was all about a will, and it was a will worth, well, their estate was worth well over several $1 million.
The jury in the British Columbia Supreme Court finds Robert Frisbee guilty of first-degree murder in the bludgeoning death of 80-year-old San Francisco socialite Muriel Collins Barnett. Justice Lloyd Mackenzie sentences 59-year-old Robert Frisbee to life in prison.
The lawyers for Muriel Barnett's estate, they got him a settlement of a few $100,000.
And in the end, he still gets the money.
Basically helped pay his legal fees ultimately, just so that it would not drag out for years.